first tour we've been able to do since this year began, really. We are going to be taking, basically we called it the footprints of the trade. And so it's going to give you an introduction to the history of Richmond to a degree, as well as the history of enslaved and free black life in Richmond in the 18th and into the 19th century. Okay? We do that because we are standing on the geography, not so much the topography, of that era. We can put our feet on the places where Richmond began, where our lives as residents and the founders of this city, and as people who have gone through these many experiences and contributed to the Richmond that we have today. We can start here, right? And that is going to allow us, especially as we go through this tour, to connect to what's happening now. And that's really the point of it, right? You understand what happened, you get a better sense of the patterns of decision making that get us to where we are today, and where this all sits in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement, and in relationship to monuments and what they do in the landscape, right? So, all right, how was that? Did you hear most of that? Okay, I'm learning. I'll pretend. All right, so just before, is that you need me to do that? Of the Defenders here. Phil Waledo is a co-founder. This is Timir Gore. He is a member of the Defenders. Jim Armstrong, right there, is a member. And we are folks that have been working on this issue and this turf in many ways since the early 2000s, right? So I've given you a brief introduction, but let me just give you an idea of the path we're going to take. And then I'm going to let Phil say a few words about the effort to secure the Shockoe Memorial Park and sort of where that stands at this moment. So we are going to start here. We are on the site of the African burial ground. Over there where the two markers are, may be about midway in terms of the ground once stood. It is about 20 feet beneath us, even at this level, and it was between the creek and what they call Shockoe Hill. We're going to walk from there down to only we're going to be on this side of the street. So there at 17th and Broad. We're going to walk down 17th and go as far as Franklin Street. And then from Franklin, we're going to turn and go to Ambler, which runs parallel to the railroad tracks. Walk back to the Devil's Half Acre Lumpkins Jail site. And so we will stop at a couple places along the way. I have asked somebody to hold at each one of the stops. Okay?
Stuck holding it. Okay, it works. So there we go. The previous one we had died, partially because I tried to fix it, but it had been confiscated by the police at an anti-Klan rally in Wisconsin. And the police put it on the ground and beat it with nightsticks. This is true, because it's quite an effective thing, you know, at a protest, so we're glad it worked. Anyway, some of you, hopefully a lot of you, may be aware that Mayor LeVar Stoney held a press conference a little while ago at the site of the Devil's Half Acre, across Broad Street, and announced that he had $3.5 million available to start the development of the 9-acre Shockoe Memorial Park. And we have succeeded in getting him to endorse the park by getting all the other mayoral candidates he did come out and endorse, and it was quite an elaborate statement that included the burial ground, the Devil's Half Acre, and 2 blocks east of the railroad tracks that the developers who contribute to the mayor and most of the elected officials desperately want for development. So it was very significant that he did endorse. And then he had this press conference and said he had, not that he was going to try to get, but that he had $3.5 million. And we asked him specifically after the press conference, do you have the money now, or do you, is there some process you have to go through? He said, no, we have it now. And we will ask City Council for $25 to $50 million for the development of Shockoe Bottom in general. Okay, turns out what he said was not true. That Jeremy Lazarus of the Richmond Free Press did a story and exposed the fact that, no, that $3.5 million, if it exists, and Jeremy questioned whether it actually existed, would have to go through City Council. They would have to approve it. Stoney knew that at the time of the press conference. So did City Council member Cynthia Newbill, who spoke at the press conference. So did Dolores McQuinn, former member of the City Council and chairperson of the so-called Slave Hero Commission, who spoke at the press conference. And Councilman Jones, who for some reason was invited to stand behind the speakers, although he has nothing to do with the issue, but he is a political ally of the mayor. He knew. They all knew that this was a fraud. So the next thing that happens is Jeremy interviews some members of City Council, and I don't want to give the names because I'm not positive I remember which one said it, but at least 3 of them said they wouldn't consider any money for the Memorial Park in the middle of a pandemic when people were facing evictions. This is a false dichotomy. And we issued a statement, the Sacred Ground Project issued a statement and said, we don't want any money going to the Memorial Park while people are in danger of facing evictions, and there are thousands in Richmond, the city with the 2nd highest rate of eviction. This is hypocritical to counterpose Memorial Park versus saving people's housing. What is necessary at this point, and completely feasible without spending a dime of city money, is to simply impose protective zoning on the footprint of the Memorial Park, the 9 acres. That's all they're going to do. And this African burial ground, which was reclaimed from a VCU parking lot back in 2010, 10 years ago, has never received protective zoning from the city. Why? Because they're hoping we're going to forget about the issue and they can move on to develop this land which the developers want, particularly H. Louis Salomonsky, who has donated to practically every politician of any stripe in the city and is a big friend of the mayor, and who went to jail in 2003 for bribing a member of City Council on a development issue. We're talking about money, developers, real estate, profit on one side, and reclaiming and properly memorializing what is clearly one of the most important historical sites to the black community anywhere in the country, where maybe half of all African Americans can today trace some ancestry. The 2nd largest slave market in the country, next to New Orleans, and the epicenter of the U.S. domestic slave trade, because this was the wholesale district that supplied all the retail districts throughout the South. This is an important struggle, and 100 years from now, this is one of the things that people will be talking about. That this was the generation that either preserved this sacred ground or lost the opportunity forever. Our organization has been fighting nearly 20 years. Others have fought longer than that. We're not giving up. We're not giving up. We've drawn a line in the sand. This land is sacred, and giving it up is unacceptable and will not happen. So that this stage of the struggle right now, and we'll be sending out a note to all members of City Council tonight demanding that they take up the issue of protective zoning. And we'll be writing all the candidates for their positions, demanding them they do the same thing, and all the candidates and the incumbent for the mayor's position. So the next step in promoting this in a mass way, because it's only when the people of Richmond come out and make this issue their own that we get any leverage. 2, 3, 4, 5, 45 people like here today, we can't do it. It has to be thousands, and it has been in the past, and the sentiment is still there. So the next expression of that sentiment will be on Saturday, October 10th at 5:30 p.m. here at the burial ground, where there will be the 18th annual commemoration of the execution of the great slave rebellion leader Gabriel, who was hung here for his leading role in the attempt to overthrow slavery in the state of Virginia. And we gather every year to symbolically stand with him. On the day he died, it was howling mobs. On his anniversary, it's his comrades and supporters and admirers. Saturday, October 10th, 5:30 to 7. 5:30 to 7. And you can go on the Facebook page for the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, and from there you'll get all kinds of links. So that's where we stand now. And the purpose of this tour is to familiarize folks who are not, don't know about the issue, and to refresh the memory of those who do, and to rededicate ourselves to this fight. And please, we hope what comes out of this is that you will decide to come back on October 10th and bring as many people as possible. It will be a socially distanced event. We got some really interesting cultural presentations planned. It's always a very moving ceremony. It takes place during sunset. We have a lot of tiki torches. We used them long before anybody else did, and we're not giving up our tiki torches. So it's a very dramatic and cultural uplifting and politically powerful event that we hope you join us. So thank you so much for coming out today to the rally, and we're back to Anna Edwards.
Okay, so we're going to start the tour now. What we're going to do is we're going to walk, you know what, we'll start right here. And then once we finish here, then we'll walk to 17th and East Broad. So as I mentioned before, you are standing in an area where the African burial ground once was. That burial ground existed from 1799 to 1816. The city of Richmond had been established back in 1737, but at that point it really was a collection of tobacco warehouses, so that the plantation owners, the tobacco farmers from around the region would bring their stuff here. They would pay to have their tobacco stored and sorted, and then from there they would make the sales, and they would be distributed via the James River, because the James River was the superhighway, right? The other thing about the James River is that it was the power source. And hydropower, water power, drove the economy, drove the industry for the city of Richmond. During the Revolutionary War, which of course began in 1776, ran through 1783, in 1780 they held a vote in Williamsburg, which is where the General Assembly once was, and decided that Richmond was going to become the capital because, frankly, Williamsburg was becoming very difficult to defend from the English or from attack. So they moved the capital to Richmond. At that time, Richmond was really a village. It may have had somewhere around 1,000 people living in and around the area. The busiest day was market day, and that usually took place once or twice a month. After it becomes the capital, suddenly there's this big influx because all of the government officials are going to be moving to Richmond. This is where they're going to hold the assemblies, and so businesses are also going to grow up around that. So you got lots of taverns, lots of places to hang out, lots of inns, and lots of warehouses that are beginning to be constructed as well. So this city is growing, and not only is it growing in terms of what I just described, it's also growing because of the infrastructure projects that have been determined that were important for this area, and specifically, again, because of the river. So getting goods from the west to the east or to the Atlantic means you have to deal with the falls. The falls, of course, are the great power, but they're also the great barrier. So the canal system is established, the James River Canal system. The Kanawha, right, James River and Kanawha Canal system. This was apparently the idea of George Washington, so he's been through here. He stayed at a tavern in Richmond in those years as well. There was already a canal that had been established on the west part of town. The Kanawha Canal connected it, and from that point, bateaux are able to move goods all from the western part of the territory through Richmond and out, right, for export. The state penitentiary, the very first state penitentiary, went under construction in this period as well. And the other was the Capitol building, right? So all of these major markers, these are huge infrastructure projects that are bringing laborers. So not only is the growing of tobacco and wheat and other goods expanding in Virginia and creating an increasing need for more and more enslaved labor, you also have the urban dynamic of the city of Richmond, where industry is growing and workers are being recruited and enslaved labor is being leased in order to work in all of these different industries. Another big one, specifically because of the river, is the flour mills. So wheat is huge here. We talk about cotton and tobacco, cotton later, but wheat is also an incredibly important crop at this time, and the milling of that into flour and its value as an export crop is making people a lot of money, all right? So I say all of that to give you a sense of how busy this place is. And then after you get into the 19th century, we've got the railroad, we've got the iron industry. This is a rapidly growing metropolis, even though it starts with about 1,000 people. When we get to the point of Gabriel's Rebellion, which took place in 1800, the city has gone to now 5,700 people, and fully 50% of that population is African. When you see historical depictions of the 18th century of any city, what you are shown is essentially a European city. You are not shown the working class or the servant class or the enslaved people. So we don't have a sense that our communities were actually quite mixed, right? And people were accustomed to living in and amongst each other. And that's a small point, but it's still a point. And you have to keep that in mind if you think about a city where 50% of the population is black, then 50% of the population has an impact on the city and how it develops and what grows, what institutions are here. This burying ground was the first municipally assigned spot for enslaved and free black people to be buried. It was put on the docks of the town council in the same session that they also approved the expansion of the cemetery at St. John's Church. So St. John's Church, which was known for its burial, for the cemetery that was accompanied by it, they knew that they had to expand it because the population was growing and they needed places to bury people. And so they decided, we'll expand that for our white residents and we will establish this for our black residents. In 1816, this site closed, and the second African burial ground, which is what we call it now, was established up on Shockoe Hill, a little further up Shockoe Valley. And we may talk about that, or I may point you to resources about the fight that's going on now about that site, okay? So this gives you a sense of, here we are in this oldest part of the city, and we are now, as we walk this tour, going to move through time. So we're going to move a little further into the 19th century as we talk about Richmond's evolution to becoming the epicenter of the domestic slave trade during the 1830s through the 1860s, through the end of the Civil War. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay. All right, so we're going to shut this off. I will lead us in now avoiding the noise. So, I'm going to keep working through it. I'd like to stop here because we're standing under the railroad trellis, right? You get a sense of the transportation issue, and what's being passed around is a marker that essentially is a general description of Shockoe Bottom District. So some of what I said earlier, but just a concise way of describing the general significance of the Shockoe Bottom District. This particular marker here talks about transportation. And when we talk about the slave trade and we talk about freight and import and export, it's obviously about shipping, right? It's about how things get moved in and out. So this marker reads, from 1830 to 1840 alone, it is estimated that between 10,000 and 11,000 people were sold each year from Richmond and transported to trading districts and plantations farther south. Some were carried by the Virginia Central Railroad, that's between 1851 and 1868, which later merged with other railroads to form the present-day CSX, whose trains you can see running today overhead in Shockoe. The earlier railroad used to advertise that if traders paid to transport adults, it would carry the children for free. Discount programs. You begin to get a sense from the language that we are talking about an economic system. Bookkeeping terminology, right? Other enslaved people were sent south in ships, leaving from the Manchester docks, thus popularizing the phrase, sold down the river. Tens of thousands more made the journey south, on foot, in coffles, walking the fall line, which ran from Fredericksburg through Richmond to Montgomery, Alabama, right? One of the people who made that journey, and it was a famous journey by ship and by rail, was Henry Box Brown. And there is a box, sort of a replica box monument that was created that is over by the flood wall, pretty much in a straight shot from here. He had himself nailed up in a wooden crate and shipped by rail and boat to abolitionists in Pennsylvania. You can only imagine what it must have been like, because he did end up upside down for part of that time, and the trip took longer than he thought. But it's one of the dramatic moments, right, that we know about to help express, one, that somebody would work that hard and take such a chance in order to free themselves from slavery. But it also speaks to the level of activity here, that there were so many ways in which people were affected by the slave trade and used creative imagination to figure out ways to get out of it. But the other point of this is to talk about how very mundane and ordinary it was. Slavery as a practice, and enslaved and free black people living in this society. This was a part of daily life. This was not an exceptional addition to the population. They were here from the time Richmond began, right? And they affected the way that the city developed, either because people did live and work together, or because they would decide at a certain point they didn't want to. And as segregation began, this began to affect the way that the city developed, very much in a physical way as well as a psychological way. Any questions at this point? Okay. We are now going to standing at the corner of 17th and East Broad Street. When the city was first established, this would have been the edge of the brand new town as it was laid out on this side of Shockoe Creek. Shockoe Creek would have been running past you right here, emptying out to the James River. So this is really, at that time, you could almost call it First Street, although I think it may have been A Street. I'll have to double check that. But in the old map, you can see that along this area was what they called a common. So basically the area from the first of the buildings right to the creek's edge, and that would have continued on to the river's edge. And along the James River, that area would have been a common area. Gradually, of course, as we described, the industry develops and pretty much all of the riverside areas get developed, become docks or wharfs, warehouses. It's all built up. So very much like today, it's hard to get to the riverside unless it's been protected as a park, because pretty much the very wealthy have purchased that waterside property. At this time, it's industry, right? Most people of wealth and means are heading uphill. It's not pleasant to live by industry and by the river where all the work is going on. So they developed the neighborhoods like Church Hill. And Church Hill was the first early affluent neighborhood of the city of Richmond.
This also bridges later an intersection. Once they decide to control Shockoe Creek and more industry is developed in this area and this begins to really grow as a community, it's all, two-story, pretty much two-story, maybe 3 or 4-story buildings, and they're going to be dedicated to retail as well as wholesale business activities. But the thing that we like to talk about at this point is the way that it's a combination, actually. I'm going to hold both. So it's a combination of the industries that are in this area that can be called supporting industries to slavery. So here's Baker, Pleasance and Company with offices at the northeast corner of Union and Franklin Streets, who were auctioneers and commission merchants associated with NB Hill, possibly regarding the hiring out of slaves. So they run a business to rent and lease enslaved people, and those things tend to happen on an annual basis. The Confederate President's White House, right through the Civil War, hired enslaved people from local owners on annual contracts running from January through December of each year. Because of that, Christmas time, which for many people might be a period of joy and coming together, for enslaved people would be a period of mourning, because this is when they would find out where they would be going to work for the next year. And typically speaking, it wasn't right next door. Many commodity brokers who sold anything, including people, had their offices along East Carey Street, from west of 15th to about 19th Street. Then there were the many businesses that serviced the slave trade, such as law firms, insurance companies, blacksmith shops, dry goods stores, including the original Tallheimer's one-room establishment founded in 1842 on 17th Street between Franklin and Main, as well as clothing houses that were made to ensure that those who were waiting to be sold were properly dressed for viewing. And I want to speak to that a little bit, because the idea that the enslaved, of course, are not well cared for people on the one hand. On the other hand, if you're preparing them to be sold and you're trying to get the highest dollar, then you're going to try and make people look as good as they can. And that still is going to run from a broad range, from the independent dealer who may be selling 1 or 2 people that he picked up in his travels, all the way to what we would consider a Lexus or a Mercedes dealership, where they operate out of the basements of the fine hotels that are set up in Shockoe Bottom for people who are buying and selling, right? So it runs that gamut. I have in the past used the metaphor of car dealerships, because we have all seen every kind of car dealership, and we can understand the exact same way that you buy and sell a car is also the way that people might buy and sell people, from an individual purchase to a fleet purchase, right? And again, the business language was applied at the time. Now, this isn't to say that people didn't know that they were selling human beings. They were very aware that they were selling human beings, right? This one, it talks about the jails and auction houses. So specifically, it says about a half a dozen jails were scattered across the district. Now, a jail is a holding place where you're preparing people. They've either been brought in and they will be held at a jail, or they are going to be prepared for sale from that location. And they may be there for overnight, they may be there for a few months, and obviously they're going to be trying to move people as quickly as possible. The most notorious at the time was Lumpkin's Jail, Robert Lumpkin's Jail, a complex known as the Devil's Half Acre, and that's where we're going to wind up the tour today. And it included a small hotel and a restaurant, as well as the jail. Smaller jails, some of them just penned areas, were often attached to trader offices, and Shockoe Bottom held somewhere between 40 and 50 auction or trader offices at any given moment. Most of them along 15th Street, known at the time as Wall Street. Other auctions were held in places like the Exchange, St. Charles, and City Hotels, the Metropolitan and Oddfellows Hall, as well as Bell Tavern. It was very commonplace even before this period for auctions to be held in front of taverns. They were where people gathered, and so the tavern owner could earn extra money by charging a fee to the broker who wanted to hold the sale there. By this time, the export of enslaved Africans was Virginia's largest commercial enterprise, And some of the features in this area include the cage, a jail for men of both races, the town whipping post, and a dunking pool, which were situated between Shockoe Creek and the 17th Street Farmers Market. In 1841, and this is where we were intentional about making sure that every one of these markers had a story of resistance on it as well. So we're talking about the conditions at the time. We can talk about the slave trader offices that were nearby, but we can also talk about resistance. And in 1841, a group of enslaved Africans held at Lumpkin's jail were being shipped on board a ship called the Creole Brig. So this is Robert Lumpkin's shipment of people that is headed to New Orleans. And the Creole Brig, which was owned by Richmonders by the name of Johnson and Epperson, was headed to the massive market in New Orleans, and while off the coast of British-controlled Nassau, the enslaved women and men rebelled, led by a man named Madison Washington, who had previously escaped from slavery in Richmond, only to be recaptured when he returned to try and free his wife. The success of the rebellion on the Creole Brig was possible because it happened off Nassau. The ship was brought into Nassau's port, and because England at that point had abolished slavery, they pretty much declared that the people there, if they got off the ship and set foot on land, could be protected. And almost everyone did, but there was one woman with her 2 children who was completely terrified by the whole thing that was happening and was basically too traumatized to trust getting off the ship. So she stayed on the ship, and as a result, she ended up being returned to Richmond and to bondage on that ship. So it's difficult to imagine what people go through when this is the kinds of decisions that they face and have to make, and experiences. If you are someone who comes from you come from a plantation outside of the city, you have known nothing except the bounds of that farm. And then they've decided to sell you, and they bring you into town, and you are held with your children in a jail, and you don't know if they're going to sell you together or apart. And then they put you on a ship, and you're going somewhere, and you don't know what's going to happen. And then suddenly the whole thing explodes in a rebellion. It's really traumatic to think about what was going through that woman, that mother's mind, with her 2 children, trying to figure out what was the right thing to do. And in the end, her decision meant that they did not get the freedom that those who stayed on the island of Nassau got, but she did what she thought was the right thing at that moment. Right? So it's a description, it's a way to think about, go ahead and put those away. It's a way to think about that these kinds of experiences are a part of daily life, that there are probably people today that are facing experiences that are similar. There are things happening around them that are disrupting their lives, and they're trying to figure out what to do, especially if their decisions are going to affect their families immediately. So how do you factor that in, and how do you decide what may, in 10 years' time, be determined to have been the right thing to do, but in that moment you have very limited set of choices in front of you, and you do the best you can. Okay, from here we are going to walk down to the next intersection, and before I talk there, I'm going to turn the mic over to Joseph Rogers. He's also a member of the Defenders. He's also running for 7th District City Council person, and so he's not here in that capacity, but I'm just letting you know that. So anyway, but any questions at this moment? Okay, so.
For giving me the opportunity to speak. I was not fully expecting to have this chance, but I am glad to be able to do so. My name, as Anna mentioned, is Joseph Rogers. I am with the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, and have been for the last 3 years, and it's been an honor and a pleasure to be able to work beside both Phil Waledo and Anna Edwards, and Tamir, who's not come on this year, which is great. And we also encourage everyone else to come on if you have the urge to do so, because we do need more people in this fight. We need more people to help out in whatever capacity they have available for themselves. I think what I wanted to talk about here is kind of the generational struggle that is in this space, that lies in this space. I happen to be a descendant of a man named James Apostle Fields. Now, James Apostle Fields was born into slavery, or as I like to say, he was enslaved at birth in the 1840s. And in 1844, he was born in a small farm up in Hanover County. He was born to a woman named Martha Ann Fields, and she had 11 children in total. And Martha Ann Fields and James, they were enslaved in that small farm in Hanover County. They all endured the horrors of slavery as well. And one of the things about James and his story is that while one day he was actually out fixing wood rails and fences, he decided that these condemned rails, they were no longer good. He would take them on this cold day and turn them into a fire. So he took some of that wood and he put it off for himself, and he made himself a fire, kept himself warm for that night. But unfortunately, as soon as the man who had owned him and owned that wood found out that his property was burning his property, he decided he got a little bit angry about that, and he more or less destroyed James back. He whipped him to the point where for 2 weeks James was unable to get out of bed, unable to walk, unable to do anything but be taken care of by his mother and have food dribbled into his mouth. He was not in any good way, and he knew that this was going to be a problem for him because this had made him so understandably angry. That when he finally was able to get up again, James looked at his mother and he said, "If I ever see Phil Winston again, I'm going to kill him. So I know I have to go." And so James, in that moment in 1863, this is in the height of the Civil War, he decides to leave that farm in Hanover County. He makes his way into the forest, into the woods, and he ends up coming down eventually to the city of Richmond. Now what's interesting also about James's family is that when he gets to Richmond, he's not alone. In fact, James's brother is living here in the city because his two older brothers had both been hired out earlier in the year. So just in the same process that we were talking about earlier, James's brothers were here in the city, more or less living on their own. Well, one of his brothers was here in the city, the others in King William County, more or less living on their own. And so James was able to hide out with them. And for a time, he worked in freedom with the kind of autonomy that he would have enjoyed until, unfortunately, he was captured. And so during the time of James's capture, between him being found out and then the overseer coming to take him back to that little farm in Hanover County, James is held somewhere right around there. In this area is where that freedom seemed to be something that was going to go away for a second time in James's life. But not knowing exactly what was going to happen, he only knew that it would be worse than it was when he had first left. And so, while I can only imagine, because we do not have any of those filing writings for him about his time in the jails there, I can only imagine that as he is sitting there surrounded by other people, all of their fates uncertain, in the middle of a war which has suddenly become one to end slavery, James is only thinking about how he can hold on to that freedom that he tasted for so many months. And so, when that overseer does eventually show up, and when they take him out of the jails, and when they start heading back up to Hanover County, James starts working. And I am glad to say that he never made it back to that farm. Because James, after they stopped off in a little tavern between Richmond and Hanover, he was shackled or tied up to a stovepipe, and then the overseer went into the next room to sleep. And James was able to work his way out of those bonds. With the help of a young woman who was also working at the tavern, he escaped and ran until he could get to the other side of the river. And eventually James did get to freedom. He linked up with the United States Army. He served as a scout until the end of the war. And then well, not to the end of the war, but close to the end of the war, until late of 1864, when he ends up in Hampton. And as he's walking into Hampton, who does he spy but his mother, his younger brothers, his younger sister, and the rest of the family that had been left behind in Hanover County, having their own separate freedom stories. They all made their way down to Hampton, and that family was reunited again. And the reason I talk about James's reuniting is also because in April 3rd of 1865, when the United States Army does walk into the city of Richmond for the first time in over 4 years, those same pens, those same jails that had held James and held countless others were suddenly thrown open. And according to Chaplain Garland White of the United States Colored Troops, the slave pens and jails were thrown open, and by the thousands there was a great rejoicing and praising of God. This spot was a spot of oppression. It was a spot where thousands of people were brutalized, beaten, sold, treated like property, treated like cattle, treated in so many terrible, horrible ways. But it is also a spot where certain people realized their freedom for the first time. And so as we walk through these grounds, we recognize that it is sacred not just because of those who died, those who were sold, and those who were tortured and who felt that kind of punishment, but also because of those who felt liberty and freedom and salvation in a moment where they did not know where certainty lay. And so again, as we move forward, I like to celebrate that, and I would like to all of you, thank you for being here.
So this intersection here at Franklin and Ambler. When I talked about the origins of this city, you know, most of the streets that we walk on in Shockoe Bottom are the same streets that were here, laid out in 1737, right, and built upon. Most of the streets that we now know with names were known by letters. So Franklin actually was F Street, believe it or not. And I do that just to, again, to re-emphasize the fact that the history of the landscape is very much with us. So we should be able to imagine the comings and goings. Daily life for enslaved and free black people, as Joseph was talking about, we talk a lot about the suffering that went on here, but we also really do have to talk about the fact that in spite of that, people work to make lives. And they normalize as much as they possibly can, while at the same time being hyper aware of what they have to do to survive and make themselves as whole as they can through all of that. One of the ways, of course, is work. Do what people do on a daily basis. This marker talks a little bit about that. From sunup to sundown, Shockoe Bottom was alive with the activities of men, women, and children, black, white, Jewish, and Indian. We still have Indian people here. It's not talked about, very rarely included in the stories, but Indian people having been driven out of the area to a large extent, nonetheless, there are still people here living, working, building lives. Enslaved workers often lived independently in boarding houses. Some enslaved men married or were in relationships with enslaved domestic women who would live with them in an owner's home, or they might, if the circumstances allowed, they might actually be allowed to rent a room in one of the many tenements. One of the things about the design of city blocks at this time is that you might see businesses all on the outside of the block, but on the inside of the block would be living quarters or tenement buildings, apartments, that kind of thing. So that was a very common arrangement. And one of the blocks of Franklin, and I think it's maybe closer to 19th Street, some of that original configuration is still there. Some of the buildings that are on the interior of that block are either remnants of those buildings or sit where some of those tenement apartments actually once were. Slave and free black dwellings have been identified on 18th and 19th Streets, as well as in the center of the block between Franklin and Main. Tenement quarters, while crowded and unhealthy, also provided some measure of protective community. People live close together, they form communities, they become interdependent. Boarding houses, grog shops, and other small enterprises that were owned by free blacks provided the basis for the emergence of a black business class, which supported institutions such as the First African Baptist Church at College and East Broad Street. Right? So as we have this growing free black community in Richmond, which numbered somewhere around 600 just after the Civil War, just after the Revolutionary War, and by the time we got to the 1860s, the population was close to 12,000 in this area, right? So that's a large, it's almost 20% of the population that was black, and then a percentage of that was free. So this is a growing set of communities and neighborhoods in Richmond. And so to mark the institutions, including burial societies, the development of the cemeteries, we talk about the first African burial ground and the second African burial ground, but those were municipal sites. We also have the private ones where societies were formed so that people could then subscribe and purchase a lot in a private cemetery. So we see the evolution even before the Civil War, even before emancipation, of these institutions that were cultivated and developed as part of black communities. Education was incredibly important. Everybody recognized that, especially people who had become free and were trying to make it in society. And so if they couldn't establish schools, which was incredibly difficult, certainly in the South, they would still find ways to hold either associated with church services or privately and try to teach people to read and expand their education. We have barbers, you have blacksmiths, there's a full range of occupations that people are involved in. We often hear the stories of the people who rise meteorically to some phenomenal success, right? So we hear about the super affluent African Americans of these periods, but we don't hear about people who simply are working to live their lives, and that's the vast majority of people. Luther Porter Jackson was a historian who taught in Petersburg at BSU in the 50s and 60s, I think. And one of the books that he wrote called Free Negro Labor of 1830 to 1865, and he enumerates all of the different occupations, the incomes, and even names people who are not only able to make a good living, but are able to purchase property, and in some instances are able to pass that property forward to their children, and sometimes even to a second generation. It's probably more disheartening to see how, for everyone in many ways, it was very difficult for much to actually pass to the next generations, because typically upon death you had to pay your debts, or the debts of the person who had passed. So again, I'm starting to sort of wander into these terms that are sort of mundane and ordinary, right? Because we are trying to give you a sense that people lived really regular lives here, or at least what was regular at that time, and how people who are living simultaneously as enslaved and free people are trying to sort that out. And the last distinguishing point I'll say to that here is that the life of a free black person was often not significantly different than the life of an enslaved person, because freedom did not give them citizenship, not wholesale citizenship, and even if it did, and when it did give them citizenship, it did not give them the right to vote. So there was never any representation. So their lives were often described as simply not enslaved, but they were still subject to the same strictures that enslaved people were. Nonetheless, people fought and worked and made their way and did their best to pass that forward as well. You're welcome.
Hey, can I say something? Please, I want everybody to know.
Come on.
This from me, only one. Y'all can throw a penny on there if you want, whatever.
Here, I'll hold it for you, and then you can go because the pocket there.
Jimmy, my name's Gregory. My Muslim name. But my great-great-grandmama came
came on a ship here, and her house is back there where all my ancestors laid back behind the railroad station. Man, I'm gonna let y'all know, I'm not no dirty brother or anything, but I live this ground and I'm hungry. Because you know why? Because I want to live free like the Africans live free in the woods. But I can say this much to y'all. Guess what? If y'all can make America business and beautiful, do it. Because you know what? I can't do it by myself. And that's why I'm out here home. And God bless y'all and amen.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Any observations?
Oh, it's a little white house through there.
The Winfrey Cottage.
The little one right behind the railroad track.
Okay.
That's where my ancestors came.
Well, we're going to go over there in just a few minutes. All right, so from this point, what we're going to do is we're going to walk that way. Although, you know what? We don't have to anymore. Let's walk through here. Actually, I'm going to beg everyone's forgiveness. We are standing now on the site of really what was part of the central area of Shockoe Bottom where the slave trade was conducted over that 30-year period. We're actually literally standing in the yard of another slave trading complex, very much like Lumpkin's Jail, which is right next to us. And I like to remind people of that, or let people know, because very often in these conversations, we only get little bits, little sound bites of it. And so people have sometimes thought that Richmond had a single auction block where these things took place, or that Lumpkin's Jail was the slave trading complex. It was one of many. It was one of those that were very large and sold anywhere from 100 people in a lot at a time. It was one of those that had a hotel. It also had the house that the family lived in. It also had the slave pen. It also had a kitchen building. And it was a two-level complex. So upper level, and then where that wall is that runs, that sort of bisects the site, that actually is where there was a retaining wall. And on the east side of that, it was about 8 feet lower. And it was down at that lower area where the two-story slave pen building was constructed. And that's where people like Anthony Burns were held. And that's a story that you should know, and you can read a little bit more about it on the markers that are over there. At this time,
That's my great.
his point about Winfrey Cottage and his connection to Winfrey Cottage is really powerful, right? There are a lot of histories that this house represents, and this will be a part of what we're going to experience and we're going to learn. Emily Winfrey lived in that cottage from 1866, I think, until she moved to another house. But this house originally sat in Manchester. And Emily Winfrey was owned by a man who fathered 5 and possibly 7 children by her over the period from the she was between 1855, roughly, and the mid-1860s. The man was Dr. David Winfrey. He apparently never married, and he purchased her, from the records, as far as we can determine it, he purchased her to be the mother of his children. And later in paperwork, such as death certificates of her children, his name does actually end up on those death certificates. So there's a lot about the dynamics, again, of what it means to be enslaved, to father children by the man that owns you, to then, when the war ends and brings emancipation, so he is no longer going to own a slave. In this case, we also know the man knew that he was about to die. And so he purchased this house and another house for her to live in and to have an income. He also gave her 100 acres of property in Chesterfield County, which is where his family plantation had been developed and had been from the late 1700s. His family, extended members of his family, were part of the development of Chesterfield. They were associated with churches that were founded down there and also with the coal mining industry that was prevalent in Chesterfield at that time. So this is, again, another set of stories that interconnects other parts of the area directly to Richmond and what's happening here as well. These are family names that people know and are familiar with and carry forward to this day. So his connection to this site is powerful, and you can see that it means a lot for him to show us that he feels connected to it. This house was on Manchester, and Manchester had a small black community, and some of the first churches and schools that were established there, of course, are now gone. Most of what was the residential neighborhood in that area is gone. This house was saved from demolition, but we know exactly where it once stood. It stood at just one lot in from the corner of Porter Street and Commerce Road. And you can go right there, and you can stand there and imagine Emily Winfrey taking possession of this cottage and being able to raise her children there in freedom. Right? She was a member of the church that was built on the opposite corner of that same block. We don't know what's going to happen, right? It's obviously been on blocks like this since it was recovered from Manchester. Originally, it sat on the lot behind the Exxon gas station. In 2007, I think it was relocated here. So it's been here for a long time. Thank you, brother. Take good care. And now all we know is that it's still part of the city management of this area and will become part of the Memorial Park. That is certainly the plan. And the marker that we have there is a relatively new one, so we're really glad to see that the city put that up. I was describing Lumpkin's Jail over here, and what I'm going to do when we're finished is I'm going to release you to go over there. But there is something that I want you all to participate in before we wrap up. And just before we do that participation activity, I just want to mention this marker here. When we originally did this tour in 2015, there was something that had just happened in Mexico. There was a group of students, 43 students, who disappeared. Their families were looking for justice in Mexico and were not finding it from the government and from the local authorities. So they were on a tour of the United States. 3 different groups of family members were traveling in different places, and there was one group that was in Richmond that same weekend that we were doing the Sesquicentennial's final activities, of which this tour was a part. They could not come to our event, and we could not go to their event, and so we instead decided to include a reference to Mexico as a sanctuary for runaway slaves as a part of our tour to then make the connection, right? To help us understand that slavery was in the United States, but it was an international, a global dynamic at that time. The Mexican federal law of July 13, 1824 promoted the emancipation of enslaved people, stipulating that the government was prepared to compensate North American owners of fugitive slaves. In 1829, Afro-Mexican President Vicente Guerrero signed a decree banning slavery in the Mexican Republic. Texas to Mexico routes to freedom constituted major but unacknowledged extensions of the Underground Railroad. Even after the loss of Texas in 1845, Mexican officials refused to formally acknowledge Texas independence on the grounds that, quote, would be equivalent to the sanction and recognition of slavery, end quote. Mexico's principled stand on slavery was a major reason for the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, in which Mexico lost half its total territory. And yet, in its 1850 treaty with the United States, it still refused to provide for the return of fugitive slaves. It's important to know that. You go to Texas, Texas or Arizona, New Mexico, California, any of those places who have sort of a different way into the issue of slavery than we on the East Coast do, you get to have a sense of, again, the interconnectedness, the international, the diasporic story that we're talking about. Right? So Richmond is an epicenter, or was an epicenter, of the United States domestic slave trade. But that was a continuation of what had been going on before, and its tendrils reached out across the entire New World. Right? These are important dynamics because they play into foreign policy in the present. And so it's important to understand how these things played out, that you begin to recognize the patterns for how things are playing out today. I need 6 volunteers. Yep, a couple guys. We got 3 women, now we need a couple guys. A couple of non-binary folks. Right, don't be shy. Alright, so 6 all together. What do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah! Would you like to? Excellent. Alright. Before, talk and wrap up this by talking about the liberation of Lumpkin's jail, liberation of the Devil's Half Acre. Joseph talked a little bit about it, but let's go ahead and read this, and then we're going to do this reading that is going to give us a really nice personal story that took place down here. Not only did Robert Lumpkin for nearly 20 years buy and sell thousands of enslaved people, he was also known for breaking rebellious slaves. Anthony Burns, a frequent runaway at the age of 9 and 10, was captured after escaping to Boston. After unsuccessfully petitioning the courts to remain free, he was returned to Richmond and held in Lumpkin's jail. This is a direct legal product of the Fugitive Slave Act. He was punished by being chained to the floor. His release was finally... Wait a minute. That's an unfinished sentence. I'm sorry. He was punished by being chained to the floor where he was held for 4 months. And on a daily basis, he was brought out of that cell and shown to people and then put back. For all of that time, he had no contact with anyone except the owner's wife. And we'll get to that description a little bit later. His release was finally secured by abolitionist friends, but the conditions of his confinement were so horrific that he only lived 9 years after that. Even so, a brief speaking tour based on his published story furthered the cause of abolition across the country. Lumpkin's jail had operated until the United States colored troops marched into Richmond on April 3rd of 1865, liberating the city from Confederate rule and ending more than 150 years of slavery here. Greeted by thousands of people, both black and some working class, free, mostly immigrant whites, the troops held a celebration rally on East Broad Street, just north of the now liberated Lumpkin's jail. Robert Lumpkin died shortly after liberation, leaving the jail complex to his wife Mary, herself one of his former slaves. Mary Lumpkin later leased the property to a northern missionary seeking to establish a school for formerly enslaved blacks, and this is the origin of the historically black Virginia Union University. It's the birthplace of the university, but first there's a liberation story. Okay, and so what we're going to have is each person read the section that I've given them. This is a letter written by a man named Chaplain Garland White It was published in a newspaper and a journal at that time. So, why don't you come up on the phone?
Richmond, Virginia, April 12, 1865. I've just returned from the city of Richmond. My regiment was among the first that entered that city. I marched at the head of the column, and soon I found myself called upon by the officers and men of my regiment to make a speech, with which, of course, I readily complied. A vast multitude assembled on Broad Street, and I was aroused amid the shouts of 10,000 voices to proclaim for the first time in that city freedom to all mankind. After which, the doors of all the slave pens were thrown open, and thousands came out shouting and praising God and Father and Master Abe as they termed him. In this mighty consternation, I became so overcome with tears that I could not stand up under the pressure of such fullness of joy in my own heart. I rested to gain strength, so I lost many important topics worthy of note.
Among the densely crowded concourse, there were parents looking for children who had been sold south of this state in tribes, and husbands came for the same purpose. Here and there, one was singled out in the ranks, and an effort was made to approach the gallant and marching soldiers, who were too obedient to orders to break ranks. We continued our march as far as Camp Lee, at the extreme end of Broad Street, running westward. In camp, the multitude followed, and everybody could participate in shaking the friendly but hard hands of the poor slaves.
Among the many broken-hearted mothers looking for their children who had been sold to Georgia and elsewhere was an aged woman passing through the vast crowd of colored, inquiring for one by the name of Garland H. White, who had been sold from her when a small boy and was bought by a lawyer named Robert Toombs, who lived in Georgia. Since the war has been going on, she has seen Mr. Toombs in Richmond with troops from his state, and upon her asking him where his body servant Garland was, he replied, "He ran off from me at Washington and went to Canada. I have since learned that he is living somewhere in the state of Ohio." Some of the boys, knowing that I lived in Ohio, soon found me and said, "Chaplain, here is a lady that wishes to see you." I quickly turned following the soldier until coming up to a group of colored ladies. I was questioned as follows. What is your name? I'm now talking to. There has been 20 years of grief about their son. I cannot express the joy I felt at this happy meeting of my mother and other friends. But suffice it to say that God is on the side of the righteous, and will in due time reward them. I have witnessed several such scenes.
Late in the afternoon, we were honored with His Excellency, the President of the United States, Lieutenant General Grant, and other gentlemen of distinction. We made a grand parade through most of the principal streets of the city, beginning at Jeff Davis's mansion, and it appeared to me that all the colored people in the world had collected in that city for that purpose. I never saw so many colored people in all of my life. Women and children of all sizes running after Father or Master Abraham, as they called him. To see the colored people, one would think they had all gone crazy. The excitement at this period was unabated. The tumbling of walls, the bursting of shells could be heard in all directions. Dead bodies being found, rebel prisoners being brought in, starving women and children begging for greenbacks and hardtack constituted the order of the day. The 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, colored, were still dashing through the streets to protect and preserve the peace and see that no one suffered violence. they having fought so often over the walls of Richmond, driving the enemy at every point. Among the first to enter Richmond was the 28th USCT, better known as the 1st Indiana Colored Volunteers. Some people do not seem to believe that the colored troops were the first to enter Richmond. But you need not feel at all timid in giving the truthfulness of my assertion to the four winds of the heavens, and let the angels re-echo it back to the earth, that the colored soldiers of the Army of the James were the first to enter the city of Richmond. I was with them, and I am still with them, and I'm willing to stay with it until freedom is proclaimed throughout the world. Yes, we will follow this race of men in search of liberty through the whole island of Cuba. All the boys are well and similar loved, and all the conquerors are home. Catherine Garland, H. White, 28th USCT, Richmond, Virginia, April 12, 1865. Printed in the Christian Reporter, April 22nd, 1865.
Okay, that concludes the tour, and what I'm going to encourage you to do is to linger for a few minutes if you have the time, read the marker about this cottage, go into the Winfrey jail, Devil's Half-Acre area, read those markers, and if you didn't get a chance to spend any time on the burial ground, you can just go through the tunnel and do that as well.